And now our host, Stephen Lee Morris.
John Gould Rubin is the artistic director of the Private Theatre. He is currently directing a production of King Lear, starring Joe Morton at the Wallace Center for the Performing Arts in Beverly Hills. That production opens on the May 10th. John Gould Rubin, welcome to Animal Farm.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm delighted to be here.
You are directing an original version of King Lear for the Wallace Annenberg Center for the Arts. We will get to that. We will get to that. First, I am interested, you are renowned for your work in Hollywood, and yet your background there's a rich tapestry of theater that informs what you have done in the past. I would just first, I'm really interested in hearing about your theater background. You formed your own theater company. You came out of New York, and we were just chatting before this recording, and you said I was just thinking, I had a workman-like attitude. I just wanted to get jobs, and then something changed, and so. What happened, and let's eventually this is going to cycle through to King Lear.
I had been an actor for 4 years in New York and felt like I wasn't sufficiently trained, and I decided I wanted to get better training. I felt like that I just had not gotten a kind of rigorous developmental sense of what it was to be an actor, and decided to go back to school. Thought that I would get the best training in England, applied to 6 schools in England, the ones that everybody knows about.
Yeah.
And kind of just sort of casually applied to 2 schools here in the States. And one of them was Yale, which I got into as an actor. And I actually kind of stood back and reevaluated and did decide to go to Yale. And I went to Yale, and that 3-year program just changed me. Bruce Dean was dean at the time, and there was a real foot in kind of different movements in European theater at the time. And I was caught up in that, and I was caught up in that not just because those things were happening at the Rep. SERBAN, ANDREI BELGRADER. I mean, there were a lot of European directors coming in. There was a focus on what, not just the play, but also the means of delivering the play. That adventure in the theater should be in both the language and theme of the project, but also in the very ways that it's conveyed. And that as much as you need to have something new and fresh in the writing, it has to also be in the delivery. And that was something that really, really captured my imagination. So I got in with a group of people at Yale who felt that way. People who'd, among them, 2 of them were people who'd spent years in Poland with GROTOWSKI, and one who'd spent a year with KANTOR, sort of working with their company. And I just got into that movement. I just got into the swing of that. And so that kind of East European, irreverent kind of theater that was in some ways more about spectacle, where image was a larger part of the conveyance. I mean, I remember going to Einstein on the Beach, and I swear to God, Stephen, I was mesmerized. I mean, it was 6 hours, and you had no idea what the story was, and it didn't matter because the story was visually and musically more abstractly conveyed. I mean, the irony about Einstein on the Beach, there's been revivals along the way. I went to one, I don't know what it was, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and it still felt like new theater, and it was from the 70s. So anyway, that was the thrust of what happened to me. And then out of that experience at school, I joined with some people from school and others that they knew from New York, and formed the Private Theatre, which was dedicated to that kind of work. And we operated doing that kind of work in the 80s, up through the late 80s, like 87 or 88. And then sort of, as many of these companies do, sort of dissolved. But ultimately, I retained, I don't know, the paperwork, and later in the 90s, when I had sort of changed and become a director and become a producer, I decided to revive the legitimacy, the legal legitimacy of the Private Theatre, and used it in order to produce work. And then I started to, I recalculated the people who had been involved and got new people involved, and started to reformat the theater and start doing work with the private theater. And we had a spottier kind of, it became project oriented, the private theater, so that we'd latch onto a project and do that project, but it wasn't seasonal. We weren't trying to create like the 3-play season and create like an audience that was expecting to get season tickets or anything like that. It really became project based and exploratory in that way, exploring literature and exploring different adventures in the theater. And it was partly my way of becoming a director. I'd become a director starting in the late 90s, and I used the private theater to be able to develop projects that I wanted to do. And that's continued until now.
Quick question, as we come through COVID, the kind of work you're talking about, which, please correct me if I'm wrong, my perception from just looking at it, in the United States, it seems to have diminished. I mean, just in quantity and interest, the kind of spectacle looking for alternative means of expression through the theater itself. Where certainly not in you mentioned Poland, and I was in Kosovo for a theater festival in November, and that's all you see is the kind of work that you're describing. And I'm wondering if you think that's a misperception on my part, or if you think that's accurate.
You know, I guess I got heartened about American theater in the 2000s, maybe the late 90s, when there were some things started to see physical theater more abstract, just more unusual devices used in the theater making, physical theater on Broadway. And, you know, I feel like we lag. I think we just lag behind, and not just Europe, I think South America. I think there's a vibrant theater community in Buenos Aires and in Mexico City, and also, you know, other areas of the world. I just think we are getting more adventurous. I think I feel like Soho Rep in New York is kind of a beacon to me, but St. Anne's Warehouse, the stuff that comes into St. Anne's Warehouse, the stuff that comes into, more interestingly, stuff that comes into BAM, Lincoln Center Theater Festival, there, it seems to me, and also the Armory. I feel like if you're looking for it, you can find stuff in New York, and not just. And I guess I would also say not just the institutional avant-garde that got solidified in New York theater in the 60s and 70s. And I mean, I'm talking about the Worcester Group and Mabu Mines and Richard Foreman. You know, that stuff. I mean, and something happened. Sorry if I'm talking too long about this, but something happened to our avant-garde, which is that it got institutionalized and remained the avant-garde. And, you know, the avant-garde is supposed to work its way into conventional theater, and then we're supposed to kind of sneer at it so that the new avant-garde can come up and wash that stuff away. And it just, for me, I don't know, in the 70s, but in the 80s and much of the 90s, it felt like that didn't happen. You know, and I loved those guys, JOANNA AKALATIS and, you know, Richard Foreman and Robert Wilson. I loved that work, but it just felt like somebody's got to step on these people and tell them they're old.
Move over.
Move over, you know, but their stuff wasn't being embraced. It wasn't becoming part of the conventional theater so that they could be old hat, you know, it just wasn't happening.
What's that? The oldest living, most promising playwright in New York. Wasn't that old? It's that joke.
But we laugh at that, but there's pain in it, you know?
Yeah, of course, of course there is. Let's just, you have a 3-year development process for King Lear, which the Wallace is producing. Let's look at the origins of that, and let's actually talk about the leading into what you're attempting to do with this play, maybe to this play, we'll see.
Inflicting on King Lear. I did a play with Joe, and that was Turn Me Loose. It was about Dick Gregory. And that play—
This is Joe Morton you're referring to.
Joe Morton, sorry, with Joe Morton. And that play came out of a devised project that I was doing at Labyrinth Theater Company. And that was going to be about the 60s. And I had an idea about 12 different or 13 different scenarios by different writers that I thought, if they were discombobulated and actually conflicted with each other, they would make, I thought I could meld them into something that was as gruesome and discombobulated as I felt the 60s were, that there would be some kind of cacophony. Well, I wanted to disabuse, I wanted to contradict the romantic notion of the 60s and address something that I felt was that there was something scary in the 60s, that there was a scary time. And I just wanted to see if I could address that. Anyway, I started working on this piece by Dick Gregory that was one of those pieces, and decided to adventure with that. And so we built this piece. I reached out to Dick Gregory. I got his permission to do it. It was my, it was something that I had done with each of these pieces. And that was a long process. I mean, that play took 7 years to develop before it went off Broadway. And part of the reason was we had a writer who was wonderful, but wasn't an experienced writer. And so we worked for a number of years with her. She was Dick's selection to be the writer. I had approached him to write it. But in the course of that development, Joe came on. We got a casting director to get somebody to play the Dick Gregory, and Joe came on as that actor, and he was into it. And so he became, for 3 years before we did it, he was working on the project with us. And it was a real collaboration. He would have ideas about scenes, and there's a whole scene in that play that was his idea that he found. And we got Morgan JENESS to be the dramaturg on it, and she really transformed it. And anyway, it became it morphed into something that really worked. And I'm sure everybody knows that in the theater, when you're developing something, getting something that really actually functions and that the audience is riveted by and works it's a thrilling and delightful and wonderful thing. And that play worked. And we had a good experience. Joe and I had a really, really good experience working on that. And as is the process with those, or often.
You're talking about process, but of a different project, correct? This is not
of a different project.
Yes.
That's right.
What was the name of that project?
Turn Me Loose.
Turn Me Loose.
Turn Me Loose played here at the Wallace before COVID with Joe. And what happened was we did it off Broadway, and it was a hit. It was a real success. The only thing that stopped the run was that Joe was doing Scandal, and he had a date certain by which he had to return to Scandal, and that was the end of the run of Turn Me Loose. And we did it out here. But because we had worked so well together, we naturally had that conversation about what else do you want to do together? And we talked about a bunch of projects, and among them was King Lear. And so he said he wanted to do King Lear. And I approached Paul Cruz, the artistic director of the Wallace, because we had gotten along when we were here doing Turn Me Loose, and he and I remained in touch. And I was just interested in what he was doing. It felt like he was doing kind of unusual and adventurous stuff. And I think he was interested in what I was doing. And he was attracted in principle to the idea of King Lear with Joe Morton, but his question was why? Why do another King Lear? Why should we mount? What's the point of mounting King Lear? And I think I think everybody can appreciate that if you're going to do a Shakespeare play or any play, but if you're going to revive a Shakespeare play, you should feel like there's a reason, like there's a motivation, that there's something you want to say about that. And in answer to Paul's query, why should we do this? Which was sort of like, how do you want to do it, John? What's your idea for doing King Lear? I said, and this goes to what my growth is as a director and as a theater maker, I said I could come up with that, but I think it would be inferior to what we'd come up with if we did it together. And I proposed a retreat with Joe and Paul and me and Morgan, the dramaturg, and Chris Barreca, the designer, another actor, Michaela Buchos-Gali, who lives out here but was in New York at the time. And we went up to the country and spent a weekend talking about the play, reading and talking about the play, and cooking and eating and talking about the play. And in the afternoon we arrived, Morgan said to Joe, why do you want to do King Lear? And Joe said, because I think it's about family. And within, I don't know how quickly, but within 15 minutes, we cut the husbands. It became more about the sisters acting on their own. And shortly thereafter, we cut Kent. I don't know if you're wincing inside because it's your favorite play, Stephen, but we cut Kent. And, you know, during the course of the weekend, we cut everybody else.
Well, he's just another spurned noble character. One in a whole, there's a train load of them.
But we ultimately, I think, came to paring down the play to the story of two families that were in their own turmoil, and finding ourselves looking at the corollaries between those families, or the parallels, and what kinds of things were happening to each of them, and and also it just became a much more pared down, cleaner version of the play. It had
You're talking about Gloucester's family and Lear's family?
Gloucester's family and Lear's family. And those two stories really are the stories of the play we're doing. But during the course of it, we also talked about the storm and started to think about the storm being constant and something that we're living with, because we're living with many, many storms that are happening all the time. And that brought us into an adventure about what does the storm mean, and launched us into a view of the play taking place in the near future, in a world in which storms are common, and going outside means engaging with the elements in a way that isn't as necessarily benign. And then what does being in the outside have to do with the transitions in Lear's madness, and what does it have to do in the transitions in Gloucester's temperament? What, you know, and so we started to see those journeys from that perspective, and then began to have real views about bringing in that world, bringing in the outside world into the world of the play, and bringing in a diminished future, a sense of a diminished future, being part of the context for the play, and that future corresponds to the vicissitudes of Lear's ability to kind of negotiate the world and his trajectory after he's had this cataclysmic break with his daughters. So I think it was sort of that weekend, those conversations, the idea of setting it the future, the idea of dealing with the environment, the idea of bringing other elements in, other kinds, like bringing in design elements that include video and a different kind of soundscape, which is living throughout the play, playing with what the outside world is in the future.
So what I've read quite a little bit about in your production, it's apparently there is a rich tapestry of visual support. I was wondering what is the video backdrops and cinematic backdrops to the story? What does that consist of? I mean, I don't want you to spoil the production, but
the butler did it.
Is so that's
I think this grew because that weekend was the start, and we came out with a version of the play that was pared down that we read that Sunday. But then we continued meeting regularly on Zoom after that, and brought other people into the conversation. We got futurists involved at one point to talk about just what was going to happen, because we're setting it in America, and you know, France is French Quebec, French Canada. You know, so that it's local and the map is local, and and we started to play with we started to talk about and think about the devices that we were going to wield in the service of creating something that is about the future world, like the way we look at the future. And so then weather became more broadly interpreted as not just storms that are brought about by natural events in the atmosphere, but also storms of information, storms of glitches in the way information is transmitted, fakery in the news. And so multimedia became a part of the story we wanted to tell. And also it became part of the means by which people communicate with each other, so that trumpets that announce that somebody's coming are coming on cell phones, or coming through some other contemporary, more contemporary device. So it became sort of the means of communication, but also we started to think about the persistence of news in the present world. We talked about what it's like to be in the Oval Office. Like there are 3 different television's on all the time. There's always news going, and that news and the way news is affecting, the momentary events of your life, how they're interrupted, how you and I could be in a conversation and one of us look at our phone and lift up and go, oh my God, something happened, some catastrophe happened. And we wanted to set the play in that world.
Yes.
That this was a
Very
man
interesting.
who was in a contemporary kingdom that had this disaster, and but the conversations were regular, and part of it was we started to get adventure into a question of what's the nature of truth? Who are the people who inhabit truth? The fool and Cordelia are the representations of truth in the world. We started talking about Cordelia as like, who at such a young age is incapable of speaking falsely and can stand up to the king and stand up to her father in such a high temperature situation as she does. And we began to think that that's a person who's already faced some incredible confrontation with their identity before that. And so it led us into issues of identity and gender, and that led us into conversations about Edgar's transformation. I mean, but again, these were long, these were conversations that were happening regularly over the course of the 3 years that brought us to this. And then when we got our designers on board, then we started to have regular conversations with them. What I think I'm trying to lead up to is this show started as a collaboration and has been a collaboration every step along the way. And if there's anything that I think I developed in the private theater when I got out of school, and in my sense of how theater can develop, is that the collaboration allows you to come up with bigger and better and more wholesome ideas than I would if I was a singular artist dictating what the thrust of this play would be. And that was my response to Paul's initial query about how we're going to do it. And I think he was resolved when we had that weekend that the conversations were so full and so adventurous, and he wanted to do something that felt like it was adventuring into a new way, like not new, different, but new, like reviving King Lear for a contemporary audience that could be exciting in a way, not just for Shakespeare scholars, but for people who want an entertainment. And so I think all of those things conspired to bring us to the views that I'm expressing about how we're doing it.
There's a fairly, even in what you described as pared down stories of those two families, this is a personal viewpoint, and I'm just wondering if it ever came up, and if it may not be in your production at all. But I am curious. It seems to me these are two families that are just eating each other alive, and that since you're setting in America, we seem to be a country that similarly is eating itself. We're now tribes of families that are eating each other alive. While what's the expression? We're trying to. The house is on fire, and we're trying to fix a leak under the sink, because we're so diverted by stupid stuff. And we're just not addressing the core problems that cause those storms, those metaphoric and very real storms. And that seems to me the real parallel for this particular cultural moment, even beyond Trump and into it's just in a way gotten sicker. And I'm just wondering if that made its way into your production, or it came up and you said, no, that's not what this is. I'm wondering how.
I think it is in the fabric of the production, but I don't think we're trying to. We're not representing any known figures in any kind of way, identifiable way. But precisely what you're describing is what we hope will be the feeling of this project when you come out. I mean, I think we want the audience to feel like what's going on is actually happening to them in the theater, and maybe happening in Los Angeles at the moment that the play is happening, that there could be a danger that we're representing in the theater that you could conceive as happening in the outer world. I think the idea of using contemporary iconography in terms of weather events and then news and informational events, is our effort to do what you're talking about,
Yes,
Stephen.
yes.
But to do it, the other thing we want, we've reconfigured the play, but we aim to be faithful to the thrust of the play and level a production or mount a production that asserts that this play is about our lives and our world, and that we should attend to the truths that this writer wrote 500 years ago, and believe that those truths are applicable to our contemporary lives, not just by extrapolation, but because we've immersed it in our contemporary lives. And
Yes.
Hopefully, I mean, you will tell me after you've been to the show, but I would like to think in a way that feels faithful to the play, in the thrust of the play, in the characters in the play, but also faithful to a bigger world I think the play describes, beyond the, I hope I'm answering your question in a palpable way, but
yes.
It's just not, we're also mindful of not doing anything that seems too
literal. It sounds like too literal.
Or
I
mean, there was a production of Julius Caesar in the park, I think, not too long ago, and and they wielded the iconography of Trump, and some like that and some didn't, but in my case I'm saying that we're not trying to do that.
Yes,
but we do hope that you feel that way. We do hope you come out and go, wow, that's about me, that's about my life.
But when you're talking about ecology, I just going to quote one line from the play, if I'm bold, because it seems very consistent with what you're doing, and I presume that line is still there, though it may not be. And that's when Gloucester discovers Lear out on the heath, and he just can't believe what he's saying, and he says, he looks at the king, who's now just a mess, and he says, "Oh, ruined piece of nature, this great world shall so wear out to naught." And I was going, well, when I read about what your production was trying to do, I thought, well, there it is in one line, that kind of the diminishment of what you're talking about. Yeah.
I really agree. I mean, I do. I think that's exactly what we're asserting or attempting to do. And I also feel like it is what I always wanted to do in the theater. And I feel like the collaboration is, I think everybody involved thinks it's the best collaboration they've ever been involved with. And I take credit for that, because I really try to do that and try to make the conversations feel less hierarchical than I think is conventional. And as a result, there are any number of ideas that when you come, may like or dislike in the production, but there are any number of ideas that I would be hard pressed to tell you where they came from.
Interesting. Well, I look very forward to seeing it. John, Gould, Rubin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Next week, Animal Farm welcomes back Leo Marks and Vanessa Stewart, who will be here to discuss Senate Bill 1116, which is the latest piece of legislation aimed at making Assembly Bill 5 affordable for small arts organizations.
If you enjoy Animal Farm, please support us on Patreon.